So it's a little bit before 4. I had tried to do this video outside, but the wind is still quite strong, and it was interfering with the mic. So we're inside looking out. That's going to be our experience this morning. So the wind, of course, is strong because we're at the tail end of a storm system that swept through last night. There were tornado warnings. Now, Kyung-Soo and Noah and I went outside to taste the electricity and feel the storm. We went out at the peak, which was a little bit after 10 in this area. And we saw lightning and rain and wind, no tornadoes. But a friend of mine who has a farm out towards Belmont area, she posted last night that a tornado did actually touch down just north of her farm. So there was some tornado activity, certainly not too far away. I don't know any details yet. The papers haven't come out, so we don't know what kind of damage there was. What's also odd is that yesterday I woke up having a tornado dream. I don't recall ever dreaming about tornadoes before, but I had a dream where I was looking out the front window of, in the dream it was my house, but it was much nicer than my house. It's funny how that happens in dreams. But seeing this massive tornado bearing down, right? The inevitability and knowing that there's nothing that we can do about it. So I don't know if the dream has any kind of significance, but the fact is that tornadoes are scary. It's a destructive force that we simply can't stand against. The best we can do is just take shelter and wait for it to pass. But could there be anything more to tornadoes? Is there any kind of meaning that we could ascribe to it? Now, I think most folks are familiar with the tornado that happens at the beginning of The Wizard of Oz. And this tornado, it picks up and transplants Dorothy and Toto, of course, to a new strange place. And it's a total transformation that happens because Dorothy, in the process of this, she has to learn how to move from being a little girl to being a strong young woman who actually sets out on a pilgrimage, on a journey, and she leads other people to this new land that she's going to. So tornadoes can signify change. It's an element of change. And as with most great stories that we see on the big screen and in books, we see it first in the Bible, really. We see exactly the same phenomenon happening with Elisha and Elijah. The names are hard to distinguish sometimes. Elijah was a prophet of God, and Elisha was his acolyte, his disciple, who was training to become the next prophet. And as they were walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, master and student. At which point Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven. So a tornado took him actually from where he was to a new and wonderful place. So we have tornadoes that we consider that they signify destruction, right, an unstoppable force, but they also signify change, and they also signify judgment. We read in the words of Jeremiah that he spoke. He said, "Behold, a whirlwind of the Lord has gone forth in fury, a violent whirlwind, and it will fall violently upon the heads of the wicked." In Proverbs, we also read that when we don't heed the call of Sophia, that's wisdom, so when we don't answer to wisdom when she calls, that panic will strike you like a storm. Your calamity will come like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish will come upon you. And who can forget that awesome scene in the book of Job when Job he's just finished complaining to God about the unfairness of his situation. And then the Lord answered Job, and he answered out of the whirlwind. And he said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." And that's just an incredible image. I'm sure Job was kind of sitting there going, "Oh, what have I done?" But despite all of this meaning that we ascribe to tornadoes, I think a lot of people would simply say that a tornado is just a tornado. It's a weather phenomenon, and it's nothing more. But look at what's going on in the world around you and ask yourself, do you feel like you're being judged? Because it certainly seems as though there's a big reckoning that's going on, isn't there? Right now we're being forced to face realities of racism and discrimination that most of us would kind of prefer to just turn a blind eye to. Right now we're seeing the effects of generations of environmental abuse as the land itself prepares to vomit us out. Right now we're also seeing that in the same way that we've disregarded the environment and the earth itself, that we've disregarded people. We're learning now that many of those people that we hold in such low esteem that we couldn't even be bothered to pay them a living wage, these are the very people who are keeping us alive through this pandemic. They've been doing so all along. I think we could very easily read some judgment into our present circumstances. But here's the thing about God's judgment. God's judgment is not a judgment that leads us inevitably towards death. Rather, it's a judgment that calls us towards repentance, to changing course, changing the way that we think, changing the way that we live, the way that we act, changing the way that we do things. So God's judgment is actually a judgment that will lead us away from death and into life if we would let it. So understood in this way, then maybe this escalating series of calamities that seem to be engulfing the world, we don't need to necessarily just consider them to be mindless, random destruction. But in fact, they may be our pathway towards a new world filled with new possibilities and new ways of living, just as the tornado was for Elijah and also for Dorothy. But it can only be such a pathway if we're able to embrace wisdom and realize that our present suffering doesn't necessarily lead us to destruction, but in fact may be the birth pangs of a new world, a world of greater peace, of greater understanding, and greater godliness. So I'm going to leave you with some words from Paul, and he writes this to the church in Corinth. He says, "This slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure." So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, because what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal.